Now, the next theoretician to contribute to the development of technocratic ideas was Henri de Saint-Simon, whose work has been described by author Frank Fisher as the prescription for Bacon's New Atlantis. According to Librarian of Congress James Billington, it was Saint-Simon's extrapolation of radical empiricism into, quote, the altogether new field of social relations, unquote, that with that extrapolation one identifies the epistemological origins of this societal model. Adherents of Saint-Simon's philosophy contended that, quote, the key to diagnosing and curing the ills of humanity lay in an objective understanding of the physiological realities that lay behind all thinking and feeling, unquote. And following this physiological interpretation of governance to its logical ends, Saint-Simon developed the precursor to Marx's scientific socialism. Saint-Simon worked under the epistemological assumption that the scientific method could be universally imposed upon the social body as well as the individual body, thereby developing a physiological interpretation of the state. And according to this interpretation, society could be analyzed in terms of its physiological components, classes, and that should sound pretty familiar to all you political science majors out there, because this functional class analysis presaged Marx's interpretation of economic classes. Frederick Engels described Marx's theory as scientific socialism because both modern empirical science and Marxism bestow epistemological primacy upon observable phenomena, what we can see, what we can detect with the five senses. Thus, radical empiricism provides the epistemological basis for all modern forms of scientific totalitarianism. Now, Saint-Simon's scientism found philosophical expression through Auguste Comte's positivism. Comte was Saint-Simon's chief disciple and a purveyor of Enlightenment rationalism. And in his book, Technocracy, The Politics of Expertise, Frank Fisher reveals that Comte promoted the concept of what was known as the positive state, a societal model that was premised upon, quote, the hegemony of science and industry, unquote. And essentially this new society envisioned by Comte amounted to a scientific dictatorship where, in the words of Fisher, quote, ideals of liberty and equality would eventually be supplanted by the technocratic values of order and progress, unquote. And this technocratic vision for society was probably a product of Comte's tutelage under Saint-Simon. Through Saint-Simon, Comte would be introduced to, according to Frank Fisher, quote, what Marx and Engels would later call utopian socialism or critical utopian socialism, unquote. Now, while technocrats have been historically at variance with Marxists, technocratic theory heavily informed the thinking of many Marxist theoreticians. Marxist techniques and ideas of scientific planning aligned themselves very closely and comfortably with technocratic concepts. Technocratic theory helps socialist regimes to legitimize their centralized bureaucratic decision-making systems because it emphasizes comprehensive social and economic planning. And of course, socialism is disseminated on the popular level under various appellations and in a myriad of forms. For instance, in 1933, Hitler candidly admitted to Hermann Röchling that, quote, the whole of National Socialism is based on Marx, unquote. Nazism was merely a variant of fascism, and that was in turn derivative of Marxism. The historical conflicts between the communism and fascism were merely feuds between two socialist totalitarian camps, not two dichotomously related forces. So we see that all socialist totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, whether of the fascist or communist ilk, qualify as scientific dictatorships. The two also qualify as Gnostic political religions, albeit an emmanatist variety of Gnosticism. This contention is reinforced by several dialectical commonalities shared by the two movements. Chief among those commonalities was an adherence to the ideas of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. He lived from 1770 to 1831. Marx's dialectical materialism was derivative of Hegel's dialectical method. Hegel thought that the God of religion was an intuition of absolute spirit, or Geist. Hegel's Geist was not analogous to the transcendent God of traditional theism, in particular Christianity and Judaism, but Hegel's God was not external to human consciousness, but immanent to it. And according to Hegel, once humanity had come to understand that history is the process of Geist coming to know itself, then humanity will discover that it is collectively part of Geist, or God. Supposedly, this re-divinization was being facilitated through a dialectical process, which Marx would later on redirect towards the socio-political realm. But Hegel's contribution to the development of Marxist dialectical materialism underscores the thread of Gnostic thought that pervades Marxism. The Encyclopedia of Religion states, quote, both Hegel and his materialist disciple Marx might be considered direct descendants of Gnosticism, unquote. According to the Encyclopedia of Religion, the Gnostic Kabbalist named Christoph Oedinger significantly influenced Hegel's early work. And as a Marxist heresy, Nazism inherited Hegel's animatist variety of Gnosticism. This is demonstrable in both movements' triadic periodization of history. Hegel posited a dialectic of three stages of freedom and self-reflective spiritual fulfillment. Marx and Hitler, who the late Anthony Sutton identified as philosophical Hegelians, also divided history into a sequence of three ages. The Marxian dialectic presented the three states of primitive communism, class society, and final communism. And of course, National Socialism followed suit, advancing the racialist utopian vision of a Third Reich. So there we have a triadic periodization of history with both movements. Now that we've established communism and Nazism as two significant derivations of technocratic theory for the 20th century, the question arises, are there any significant derivations of technocratic thought that can be cited for the 21st century? And our answer, Paul and my answer in the book, is an unequivocal yes. The Republican White House of George W. Bush was dominated by neoconservatives. And while they were consistently characterized as proponents of fiscal conservatism and small governance, the neoconservatives really supported the New Deal. And Irving Kristol, the godfather of neoconservatism, stated in his book, Neoconservatism, the autobiography of an idea, that, quote, neocons accepted the New Deal in principle, unquote. And later in his book, Kristol states, quote, in a way, the symbol of the influence of neoconservative thinking on the Republican Party was the fact that Ronald Reagan could praise Franklin D. Roosevelt as a great American president, praise echoed by Newt Gingrich a dozen years later, when it is no longer so surprising, unquote. Now, in the early days of the 1932 election, technocratic theoretician Henry A. Porter published a book entitled Roosevelt and Technocracy. And that book raised an interesting question. The question was, quote, will technocracy be the New Deal, unquote? And based on his observations of FDR's policies, Porter gravitated towards the affirmative. In fact, Porter made no effort to conceal his approval of FDR, stating, quote, only skillful statesmanship, the statesmanship of Roosevelt, and sound economic policies, sound economic principles, the principles of technocracy, can lead us out of the valley of chaos and despair into which we are plunging, unquote. In his book, Technocracy and the American Dream, the Technocratic Movement, 1900 to 1941, William Aiken reveals that technocratic enclaves in California even promoted the granting of, quote, dictatorial powers to Franklin Roosevelt, unquote. The New Deal basically facilitated the technocratic restructuring of America. And one case in point was the Social Security Act, which was inspired by a retired physician named Dr. Francis Townsend. Townsend cribbed liberally from a book entitled Looking Backward, which is a piece of normative fiction written by a technocratic theoretician named Edward Bellamy. But cribbing from that track, Townsend developed a federal program that would have allocated $200 a month to unemployed citizens over the age of 60. And according to Townsend's hypothetical plan, the recipients of this financial assistance would be required to spend their allotments of $200 within 30-day periods. Although Congress did not really pass the Townsend bill, the legislation did inspire the Social Security Act. And in this sense, Social Security was one of many New Deal machinations that originated with technocratic theoreticians. And in his book, Progressivism, the New Deal and the Technocratic Movement of the 1930s, James Dow Crabtree reiterates, quote, "In this way, one might say that the technocrats did indeed have an indirect influence on the New Deal by way of the contributors to their doctrine, Bellamy, to an activist who espoused their ideas of guaranteed income, Townsend, and finally into law," unquote.